A dog is simply minding his own business, doing nothing more than enjoying his day, until everything changes in an instant. Out of nowhere, a terrifying encounter flips his world upside down, shaking his loyalty and trust to the core. What happens when he's faced with a life-altering decision that could change everything for him and his owner? Who will save who when it all falls apart? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun crept over the distant hills, casting long shadows across the overgrown farmyard. Max stood at the end of his rusty chain, his once bright eyes scanning the familiar scene before him. The old red barn leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeling like forgotten promises. Beyond it stretched the endless fields where he used to run free, chasing butterflies and playing with Michael. The chain clinked as he shifted his weight, a sound that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. His paws had worn a circular path in the dirt beneath them, marking the boundaries of his world for the past several months. The morning dew soaked his paws, but he barely noticed any more. The screen door creaked, and Max's ears instantly perked up. Michael emerged from the farmhouse, his work boots leaving heavy prints in the wet grass. In his hands, he carried his usual tools, a worn spade and some rope. Max's tail gave a slight wag, more from memory than hope. "Michael," Max's eyes seemed to say as he took a tentative step forward, the chain rattling behind him. But Michael walked past without a glance, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the ground. The smell of last night's whiskey still clung to him like a shadow. From his confined spot, Max watched Michael make his way to the fields. The dog's head tilted slightly, following his master's movements. Every so often, Michael would pause to wipe his brow or adjust his tools, and Max's ears would prick up, hoping this would be the moment his master would look his way. But Michael remained focused on his tasks, as if the dog was just another fence post in the yard. The morning wore on, and Max settled into his usual spot where he could see both the barn and the fields. He remembered running alongside the tractor, barking joyfully as Michael laughed and called him a good boy. Now the only sounds were the distant clanking of tools and the whisper of wind through the untended grass. When the sun reached its highest point, Michael headed back to the house. He emerged a few minutes later with his keys jingling in his hand. The old pickup truck sat in the driveway, its faded blue paint matching the worn-down feeling that hung over the entire farm. As Michael climbed into the driver's seat, Max stood up one last time. His eyes, still holding a glimmer of the spirited dog he once was, followed Michael's movements. The truck's engine sputtered to life, and through the dusty window, Max watched his master's face, searching for any sign of the connection they once shared. "Why have you forgotten me?" his gaze seemed to ask as the truck pulled away, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Max stood there, his chain heavy around his neck, while the rest of the world stretched out beyond his reach. The farm sat silent and still, a lonely kingdom where a forgotten dog kept his lonely vigil. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next like watercolors in the rain. Max's world had shrunk to the circumference of his chain, marked by the worn dirt path beneath his paws. The wind whispered through the maple trees, carrying the scent of distant places he could no longer explore. A rooster's crow echoed from somewhere beyond the hills, its sound both familiar and foreign in the quiet landscape. Max spotted a squirrel darting across the yard and let out a half-hearted bark. His chase was short-lived, ending abruptly where his chain met its limit. He watched the creature scamper up an old oak tree, taunting him from above. These small distractions were all he had now. The shadows cast by passing clouds, the occasional rabbit that ventured too close, the leaves that danced across his path in the autumn breeze. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke through the afternoon stillness. Max's ears perked up at the familiar rumble of Michael's truck. His tail began to wag, more from habit than hope, as the blue pickup rolled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. Michael stepped out, his work boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He cast a brief glance in Max's direction, their eyes meeting for just a moment before he turned away. Max barked excitedly, pulling against his chain. "Look at me," his bark seemed to say. "Remember me." But Michael was already walking toward the house, his keys jingling in his hand as he disappeared inside. Through the kitchen window, Max could see Michael's silhouette. The familiar clink of glass against glass told him what would come next. Michael poured himself a drink, then another, standing at the window with unseeing eyes. Max sat in the yard, his gaze fixed on his master's shadow, waiting for something, anything, to change. The afternoon light began to fade when Michael finally emerged from the house. He swayed slightly as he walked, letting out a long yawn that echoed across the quiet yard. Max's tail wagged weakly, stirring up small clouds of dust from his well-worn path. But Michael barely glanced his way as he climbed back into his truck. The engine roared to life, drowning out Max's soft whimper. As the truck pulled away, silence settled over the farm once again, heavy and familiar. The empty space between the house and barn seemed to grow larger, swallowing up the last traces of hope that had flickered in Max's eyes. He watched until the truck disappeared around the bend, leaving him alone, with only the whisper of wind and the growing shadows for company. The night settled over the farm like a heavy blanket, stars twinkling in the vast expanse above. Max lay curled up in his usual spot, his breathing uneven as he dozed fitfully. The air was unusually still, carrying only the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. A shadow moved at the edge of the property, silent as death itself. The leopard's muscular form slipped through the darkness, drawn by the scent of sheep in the nearby barn. Its yellow eyes gleamed in the starlight as it prowled closer to the farmhouse. Max's eyes snapped open. His nose twitched, catching an unfamiliar scent that made his fur stand on end. When he spotted the predator, his protective instincts kicked in immediately. His fierce barking shattered the night's silence, echoing across the empty yard. The leopard froze, its attention shifting from the barn to the chained dog. Its muscles tensed, tail twitching in irritation at being discovered. Without warning, it sprang forward, powerful legs launching it straight at Max. Max tried to dodge, but the chain yanked him back cruelly. The leopard's claws raked across his side, tearing through flesh and fur. Pain exploded through his body, but he fought back with everything he had, snapping and snarling at his attacker. His teeth found purchase in the leopard's leg, but his restricted movement left him vulnerable. The big cat struck again and again. Each blow left Max weaker, his blood soaking into the dirt beneath him. His legs trembled, barely able to support his weight. Still, he fought on, his desperate barks turning into yelps of pain as the leopard's claws found their mark repeatedly. After what seemed like an eternity, the leopard finally backed away, deterred by Max's relentless defense. It disappeared into the darkness as silently as it had arrived, leaving Max collapsed in a pool of blood, his breathing labored and shallow. Miles away in a dimly lit bar in town, Michael sat nursing his drink. The jukebox played an old country song while conversations buzzed around him. For a moment, he paused, his glass halfway to his lips. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't place what it was. A distant echo of barking reached his ears, barely audible over the bar's noise. He hesitated, a flicker of concern crossing his face, but then shook his head and returned to his drink. The moment passed, lost in the din of clinking glasses and laughter. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as Michael steered down the familiar dirt road leading to his farm. Something felt off tonight. The usual chorus of cricket chirps seemed muted, and Max's regular greeting barks were noticeably absent. The farmhouse lights glowed in the distance, but the silence wrapped around the property like a thick fog, making Michael's stomach twist with unease. As he drew closer, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. The shadows seemed longer, darker somehow. His foot eased off the gas pedal, the truck crawling forward as his eyes scanned the property. The truck's tires crunched to a stop on the gravel driveway. Michael stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed too loud in the unsettling quiet. He walked toward the porch, his steps growing heavier with each passing moment. That's when he saw it, a dark shape lying motionless near the chain post. "Max!" His voice cracked as he called out. No response. Michael broke into a run, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he got closer, the moonlight revealed the horror. Max lay in a pool of blood, his fur matted and torn, barely moving. "No, no, no!" Michael fell to his knees beside Max, his hands shaking as they hovered over the dog's broken body. What happened? Oh God, what happened? His fingers fumbled with his phone, dropping it twice before managing to dial the vet's number. Tears blurred his vision as he waited for an answer, one hand gently stroking Max's head. "This is my fault," he choked out, rage and guilt burning in his throat. "I should have been here." His scream echoed across the empty yard, startling a few nearby birds into flight. After making the call, Michael carefully slid his arms under Max's body. The dog whimpered softly, causing Michael's heart to clench. "I've got you, buddy. I've got you now." He carried Max into the farmhouse, his arms trembling with the effort and emotion. The fireplace cast a warm glow as Michael gently laid Max on the floor nearby. His hands shook as he grabbed clean towels from the kitchen, pressing them against the worst of the wounds. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Michael whispered, his voice thick with remorse. "I should have been there for you." He watched Max's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, each one a reminder of how close he'd come to losing him completely. Max's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Michael's gaze. Despite the pain evident in those eyes, there was something else there too, a glimmer of trust that made Michael's throat tighten even more. Those eyes, though clouded with pain, still held on to that unwavering loyalty that Michael had taken for granted for so long. The morning sun crept through the farmhouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor where Max lay wrapped in makeshift bandages. Blood had seeped through in places, creating dark patches that made Michael's stomach clench. Michael hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and heavy as he watched every labored breath his dog took. The laptop balanced precariously on his knees cast a harsh blue glow across his weary face as he frantically searched for information about treating dog wounds, his fingers trembling as they moved across the keyboard. "Hold on, buddy," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse from the long night. He scrolled through various websites, taking mental notes about cleaning techniques and warning signs of infection. His throat tightened at the pictures of similar wounds, each one a reminder of how serious Max's condition was. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift back to Max, watching for any change in his condition, searching for any sign of improvement. The afternoon brought the welcome sound of tires crunching on gravel as the vet's truck pulled up. Dr. Thompson, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and weathered hands, carried her well-worn medical bag into the house. She knelt beside Max, her experienced hands gently examining each wound, her expression growing more serious with each discovery. "I'll be honest with you, Michael," she said, her voice gentle but serious. "These injuries are severe. If infection sets in, He might not make it through the night. She paused, noting how Michael's shoulders slumped at her words, his face crumpling with worry. But there's hope. With proper care and attention, he has a fighting chance. He's strong, and I can tell he wants to live. Michael's hands shook as he accepted the antibiotics and fresh bandages from her. Dr. Thompson demonstrated how to clean the wounds properly, explaining each step with patience, making sure he understood the importance of each action. Change the bandages twice daily, keep him warm, and make sure he drinks water when he can. Even if he doesn't want to, try to get him to take small sips. After the vet left, Michael sat cross-legged beside Max, carefully following her instructions. His fingers trembled as he cleaned each wound with gentle strokes, whispering soft apologies with every touch that made Max flinch. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. "I remember when you were just a little ball of fur," he said softly, his mind drifting to memories of a younger Max bounding through tall grass, his tail wagging with pure joy. "We used to run for hours in those fields. You'd chase butterflies until you were too tired to stand." His voice caught in his throat as he looked at Max's still form, so different from the energetic puppy in his memories. Max's eyes flickered open briefly, but there was no recognition in them, no response to Michael's presence or touch. The usually bright eyes were dull and unfocused, clouded with pain. Michael continued his careful ministrations, the quiet broken only by Max's shallow breathing and his own whispered words of comfort. Outside, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the room as Michael maintained his vigil beside his faithful companion, silently praying for a miracle. Days melted together as Michael devoted himself to Max's care. Each morning before the sun peeked over the horizon, he'd carefully prepare soft food mixed with the medications Dr. Thompson had prescribed. His movements were gentle but clumsy from exhaustion, dark circles forming under his bloodshot eyes. The routine never varied: clean the wounds, change the bandages, try to coax Max to eat and drink. Michael's hands trembled as he worked, his fingers carefully dabbing antiseptic on the healing gashes. Sometimes, when the weight of everything became too heavy, tears would slip down his cheeks, falling silently onto Max's fur. He'd quickly wipe them away, afraid to let his emotions interfere with the task at hand. "Here you go, boy," he whispered, holding a small bowl of water to Max's mouth. The dog's tongue would occasionally flick out, taking tiny sips that made Michael's heart leap with hope. One evening, after settling Max for the night, Michael sat at his kitchen table with a plate of barely touched food. The house felt eerily quiet except for Max's soft breathing from his bed near the fireplace. As Michael pushed his food around with his fork, his eyes caught something propped against the windowsill, an old photograph he hadn't noticed in years. His hand shook as he picked it up. The image showed a younger version of himself, his face bright with laughter as he held a squirming Max, then just a tiny puppy. The joy in both their expressions was unmistakable. Michael's eyes crinkled with genuine happiness. Max's little tail caught mid-wag by the camera. The photo's edges were worn, but the moment it captured remained crystal clear. Michael's throat tightened as he looked between the photograph and the injured dog lying across the room. The contrast hit him like a physical blow. In the photo, they were inseparable, full of life and possibility. Now, after years of neglect, after choosing the bottle over his faithful companion, Max lay wounded and withdrawn. The weight of wasted years pressed down on Michael's chest. He remembered the countless times Max had waited for attention that never came, the hopeful looks that were ignored, the excited barks that went unanswered. All those moments lost, buried under a haze of alcohol and self-absorption. Rising from the table, Michael walked to the window. The fields stretched out before him, bathed in evening light. The same fields where he and Max had once played, now standing as silent witnesses to years of neglect. "I'll make it right, Max," he said quietly, his voice firm despite its softness. "I won't let you down again." His reflection in the window showed a changed man, determination replacing the guilt that had haunted his features for so long. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse windows as Michael knelt beside Max's bed. His hands moved with gentle precision as he changed the bandages, careful not to cause any discomfort. Twice a day now he devoted time to caring for Max, creating a routine that brought structure to both their lives. "That's it, boy," Michael murmured, offering Max his breakfast. The dog's nose twitched with interest, a small change that made Michael's heart leap. Where there had once been emptiness in Max's eyes, tiny sparks of life began to return. During their morning sessions, Michael would talk softly about anything that came to mind: the weather, his plans for the farm, memories of better days. At first, his words seemed to float in empty air, but gradually Max began to respond. His tail would give the slightest wag when he heard Michael's voice, and his eyes would track Michael's movements around the room. These small victories felt enormous to Michael. Each tiny sign of improvement became a treasure. The way Max's ears would perk up at mealtime, how he'd lean slightly into Michael's touch during the evening checkups, the soft sigh of contentment when Michael scratched behind his ears. As weeks passed, Max's strength slowly returned. One morning, Michael found him standing on shaky legs by the window, watching the world outside. The sight filled Michael with both excitement and anxiety. He walked to the door and opened it, letting fresh air rush in. But Max didn't move forward. His body tensed, and his eyes darted across the yard, scanning for danger. The memory of the leopard attack still held him in its grip. His paws seemed rooted to the floor, his body trembling slightly. Michael saw the fear in Max's stance, the way his ears flattened against his head, how his tail tucked between his legs. The yard that had once been Max's domain now looked like foreign territory, full of potential threats. Kneeling beside Max, Michael spoke in soft, reassuring tones. "It's safe now, buddy. I'm here." He stayed there, patient and steady, letting Max take his time. After what seemed like ages, Max took one tentative step forward, then another. Michael matched his pace, staying right beside him as they crossed the threshold together. The morning air was crisp, and grass bent beneath their feet as they made their way into the yard. Each step seemed to bring more confidence to Max's movements. Though still cautious, his head began to lift, his nose working to catch the familiar sense of home. Michael watched with a smile as Max explored the space, staying close but allowing him the freedom to rediscover his world. Word traveled fast in their small farming town. One crisp morning, as Michael and Max took their usual walk around the property, the sound of approaching vehicles caught their attention. Several trucks pulled up near the farmhouse, and familiar faces emerged. Neighbors Michael hadn't properly spoken to in months. Sarah from the dairy farm down the road approached first, her eyes full of concern as she looked at Max. "We heard about what happened," she said softly. "How's he doing?" Michael's throat tightened as he shared the story of the leopard attack. His voice cracked when he described finding Max that night, bleeding and barely alive. "I should have been there," he admitted, the weight of his guilt still heavy in his words. The neighbors listened with understanding nods. Many of them had dogs of their own and could imagine the horror of such an attack. They offered words of support and practical suggestions for keeping Max safe. Tom Brown, a retired carpenter who lived on the adjacent property, walked the perimeter of Michael's farm, shaking his head at the old fencing. "These won't keep anything out," he said, running his hand along the weathered wood. "I can help you build something stronger." Something that'll keep Max safe. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his pride making him hesitant to accept help. I appreciate the offer, Tom, but I can handle it. Nobody's saying you can't, Tom replied gently. But sometimes it's good to let others lend a hand. We're neighbors. It's what we do. Over the next few days, pickup trucks began arriving early in the morning. Neighbors brought tools, lumber, and willing hands. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as they worked together to build a new fence. Stories and laughter mingled with the construction noise. Michael found himself slowly opening up as they worked. He shared coffee with Tom during breaks, listened to stories about other farmers' experiences with predators, and even found himself chuckling at jokes. Though still reserved, he felt the walls around his heart beginning to crack. As the sun began its descent on the third day, Michael stood back to survey their progress. The new fence stood tall and strong, a testament to community spirit. Max trotted alongside him, seeming more relaxed in the safety of their reinforced boundary. Looking at the neighbors working together, sharing tools and stories, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just a solitary figure on an isolated farm anymore. He was part of something bigger, something warmer and more supportive than he'd allowed himself to remember existed. The early morning sun filtered through the farmhouse windows as Michael moved around the kitchen. He had settled into a new routine, one that revolved around Max's care and recovery. The dog's limp was still visible, but his movements were becoming more fluid with each passing day. Michael filled Max's bowl with fresh food, adding a small supplement the vet had recommended. "Here you go, buddy," he said softly, placing the bowl on the floor. As Max ate, Michael gently ran his hand along the dog's back, careful to avoid the healing wounds. These small gestures had become natural now, woven into the fabric of their daily life. Throughout the morning, Michael noticed subtle changes in Max's behavior. The dog's steps seemed more assured, his posture a bit straighter. While Michael sat at the kitchen table reviewing some farm paperwork, he heard the familiar click of Max's nails on the wooden floor. Then something unexpected happened. Max approached him, pressing his nose against Michael's hand. Michael's breath caught in his throat. For months, Max had kept his distance, accepting care but never seeking attention. Now, here he was, deliberately asking for affection. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to pet Max's head. The dog leaned into his touch, his tail wagging with more enthusiasm than Michael had seen in a long time. "Hey there," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max responded by pressing closer, resting his head on Michael's knee. The simple gesture felt monumental, a sign that the trust between them was slowly being rebuilt. As evening approached, Michael settled onto the porch, the day's work complete. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the newly fenced yard. He heard Max's footsteps behind him and turned to see the dog hesitating in the doorway. After a brief pause, Max made his way onto the porch, settling down next to Michael's chair. To Michael's surprise, Max shifted closer until he was leaning against his leg. Together, they watched the sun sink below the horizon, sharing a comfortable silence. Michael felt a smile spread across his face, genuine and peaceful. "We'll be all right, buddy," he whispered, the words carrying all the weight of a promise. The crisp morning air carried the scent of dew-covered grass as Michael opened the farmhouse door. Max, his energy visibly improved over the past weeks, trotted out onto the porch with a newfound spring in his step. But as his gaze fell on the open field beyond the yard, his demeanor changed instantly. His ears flattened against his head, and his body went rigid. A soft whimper escaped his throat as he backed away from the sight. Michael's heart sank as he watched Max's reaction. The dog that had once loved running through those fields now trembled at the mere sight of them. The mental scars from the leopard attack were clearly as deep as the physical ones had been. Settling himself on the porch steps, Michael spoke in gentle, encouraging tones. "Come here, Max, it's okay." His voice was steady and warm, trying to provide the reassurance Max needed. The dog took a few tentative steps forward, his paws barely making a sound on the wooden boards. Suddenly, a distant rustle in the trees made Max freeze in place. His eyes went wide, and his muscles tensed, ready to bolt back to the safety of the house. The sound, though harmless, had triggered memories of that terrible night. Michael could see the fear written in every line of Max's body, could feel it in the way the dog's breathing quickened. Determined to help his faithful companion, Michael rose slowly from the steps. He approached Max with careful, deliberate movements, speaking softly all the while. When he reached the frightened dog, he gently attached a leash to his collar. Together, they began walking toward the open yard. "That's it, buddy," Michael encouraged as they took their first steps into the grass. Max pressed close to Michael's leg, his body still tense but willing to trust his human companion. They moved slowly, each step measured and careful. Michael maintained a steady stream of quiet praise, letting Max know he wasn't alone. As they continued their careful journey, Max's steps gradually became less hesitant. His head lifted slightly, and his tail, which had been tucked tightly against his body, relaxed a bit. They made their way further into the field, past the point where the yard ended. By late afternoon, Michael and Max sat together in the field. Max was still alert, his ears twitching at every sound, but he no longer seemed ready to bolt at any moment. It was a small victory, but an important one. Michael looked down at his companion, pride and affection warming his voice as he said, "One step at a time, buddy." The morning sun was climbing higher when the sound of tires on gravel caught Michael's attention. Through the window, he spotted Tom's old pickup truck pulling up to the farmhouse. Max, who had been dozing near Michael's feet, lifted his head with mild interest. Tom stepped out of his truck, his own dog, a friendly golden retriever, jumping down after him. Michael met them on the porch, offering a small wave. "Morning, Michael," Tom called out, his usually cheerful face carrying a hint of concern. "Thought you should know. There's been talk about that leopard being spotted again, just up near Miller's Creek." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. His hands grew cold and his throat tightened. He glanced down at Max, who was still recovering, still learning to trust the world again. The thought of another attack made his heart race. Later that evening, after Tom had left, Michael sat at his computer, scrolling through local wildlife reports. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed "leopard attacks farm animals" into the search bar. Page after page revealed similar incidents in the surrounding counties. The area's dense forests and scattered farms made it perfect hunting ground for big cats. The more he read, the more his anxiety grew. Every shadow outside the window seemed threatening. Every rustle in the trees made him jump. He found himself checking the locks repeatedly, even though he knew a determined predator wouldn't be stopped by a simple door lock. Max had been doing better lately, venturing further into the yard, his tail wagging more often. But Michael's own fear was beginning to overshadow these small victories. He caught himself staring out windows, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. His hands shook slightly when he filled Max's water bowl, and he started keeping the dog closer to the house during their walks. That night, sleep proved elusive. Michael lay in bed, his mind racing with images of leopards prowling through the darkness. Every creak of the old farmhouse made him tense. He shifted restlessly, throwing off the covers only to pull them back up again. A soft whine caught his attention, and he felt the mattress dip as Max hopped onto the bed. The dog settled next to him, pressing his warm body against Michael's side. It was something Max hadn't done since before the attack, this show of trust and comfort. Michael's hand found Max's fur in the darkness, stroking gently. His breathing began to slow, matching the steady rhythm of Max's. "We'll face whatever comes together, Max," he whispered into the darkness, finding unexpected comfort in the dog's presence. The late summer breeze rustled through the cornfields as Michael and Max walked along the property's edge. The new fence stood tall and sturdy, a testament to the community's support. Michael watched as Max trotted ahead, his tail held high, nose twitching at the various scents carried on the wind. These walks had become their daily ritual over the past few weeks. Each day, Max ventured a little further, his confidence growing steadily. Today, the dog paused to chase a butterfly, his movements playful and light. The sight made Michael's heart swell. It was a far cry from the frightened, injured dog who had barely survived the leopard attack. "Come on, boy," Michael called out, and Max bounded back to him, eyes bright and alert. The physical scars were still visible beneath Max's fur, but his spirit was returning. Michael felt his own emotional wounds healing too, the weight of guilt lifting with each passing day. One sunny afternoon, Michael decided it was time for a change of scenery. He and Max walked down the dirt road to Tom's farm, where Tom's friendly golden retriever, Scout, lived. As they approached the fence line, Max's steps became hesitant, his tail lowering slightly. "It's okay, buddy," Michael reassured him softly. Tom emerged from his barn, Scout trotting beside him. Max stayed close to Michael's leg at first, watching Scout cautiously. Tom kept his distance, speaking in gentle tones as Scout wagged his tail invitingly. Slowly, Max's curiosity began to overcome his fear. He took a few tentative steps towards Scout, sniffing the air. "Look at that," Tom said quietly, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "He's come a long way." Within minutes, Max and Scout were chasing each other around Tom's yard. Max's playful barks filled the air as he ducked and weaved, matching Scout's energy. It was the first time since the attack that Max had played so freely with another dog. Tom and Michael sat on the porch watching the dogs romp in the grass. "Never thought I'd see him like this again," Michael admitted, his voice thick with emotion. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Michael and Max started their journey home. Max trotted beside him, tired but content from playing. Michael looked down at his companion, feeling a surge of pride and relief. "You're doing better every day, aren't you?" he said softly. Max barked happily in response, his tail wagging. Michael smiled, knowing they still had healing to do, but they were definitely moving forward. The morning sun painted the farmland in warm, golden hues as Michael stepped out onto his weathered porch. Max bounded across the yard with newfound freedom, his movements fluid and energetic, a stark contrast to his condition just months ago when he'd been weak and withdrawn. Michael tossed a worn tennis ball, watching it arc through the crisp morning air, and Max chased after it with enthusiasm, his tail wagging wildly and ears perked with joy. "Good boy," Michael called out, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the corners of his mouth tight with worry. Even as he watched Max's joyful play, a nagging worry gnawed at the edges of his mind, persistent and unavoidable. He pulled out his phone, checking the local news for the third time that morning, his thumb scrolling anxiously through the headlines. No reports of wildlife sightings. Still, his unease persisted, settling heavy in his stomach. As the morning progressed, Michael went about his farm work, with Max following close behind, never more than a few steps away. Near the chicken coop, something caught his attention, making him stop mid-stride. A fence post leaned at an odd angle, the dirt around its base disturbed and scattered. His heart rate quickened as he examined it more closely, kneeling down for a better look. The wood bore faint scratches, too large to be from a domestic cat. too deliberate to ignore. Moving to the livestock pen, Michael's breath caught in his throat, his footsteps faltering. There, on one of the posts, were distinct claw marks, fresh ones. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the grooves in the wood, feeling the roughness of newly splintered timber. Max continued to play nearby, oblivious to his owner's growing anxiety, chasing butterflies and sniffing at interesting spots in the grass, his tail held high with innocent pleasure. Michael spent the next hour methodically checking every inch of the property's perimeter, his boots leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. His eyes scanned the tree line repeatedly, searching for any sign of movement among the shadows of the branches. Max's happy barking in the background only intensified his protective instincts, each playful sound making his heart clench with worry. As evening approached, Michael began his new, more thorough security routine, double-checking everything with meticulous care. He checked each gate twice, testing the latches with extra care, jiggling them firmly to ensure they were secure. The sky darkened to a deep purple, stars beginning to twinkle overhead as he made his final rounds, casting long shadows across the farmyard. Max padded quietly beside him, picking up on his tension, his usual bouncy step replaced with careful movements. At the last gate, Michael paused, his hand resting on the cold metal latch. Max pressed against his leg, looking up at him with trusting eyes that seemed to glow in the gathering dusk. Michael knelt down, running his hands through Max's soft fur, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat beneath. "You've been through so much, Max," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and fierce protectiveness. "I won't let anything happen to you again." They stood together under the vast starry sky, guardian and companion, while the night settled quietly around them, the distant chorus of crickets providing a gentle backdrop to their shared vigil. The night wrapped the farmhouse in an unsettling silence. Michael tossed and turned in his bed, the sheets tangled around his legs. A sound pierced the quiet, branches cracking in the distance, followed by rustling in the underbrush. His eyes snapped open, heart already beginning to race. Then he heard it, Max's frantic barking cutting through the stillness. The sound was urgent, desperate, different from his usual alerts. Michael bolted upright, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. His hands fumbled for his boots as Max's barking grew more intense. "Max!" he called out, voice rough with sleep and fear. He grabbed his jacket and rushed through the dark house, nearly stumbling in his haste to reach the door. The cool night air hit his face as he burst into the yard. Max stood rigidly near the fence line, his hackles raised and teeth bared as he growled at the trees beyond. The beam of Michael's flashlight caught something that made his blood run cold. Fresh claw marks scored deeply into the wooden fence posts, the exposed wood still light in color against the weathered surface. The leopard had returned. Michael's hands trembled as he gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam cutting through the darkness. Max, despite his previous trauma, held his ground. The dog's protective instincts seemed to override his fear as he positioned himself between Michael and the threatening shadows. "Easy, boy," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible as he carefully made his way to Max's side. His eyes never stopped scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement in the darkness. The air felt thick with tension as they stood together, waiting. A twig snapped in the darkness. Max's growl deepened. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the leopard emerged from the shadows, its eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. The big cat's muscles rippled as it moved forward, its tail low and threatening. Before Michael could react, Max launched himself forward. His bark echoed through the night, fierce and challenging. The dog that had once cowered in fear now stood as a guardian, facing down his old nightmare. The leopard pulled back its lips in a snarl, But something in Max's display of courage made it hesitate. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a final growl, the leopard turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving only silence in its wake. Max trotted back to Michael's side, his chest heaving with exertion, but his head held high. Michael stared at his dog in amazement, his heart still pounding against his ribs. "You saved us, buddy," he whispered shakily, his voice full of pride and gratitude. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farm as Michael sat on a wooden crate in the barn. His mind kept returning to the events of the previous night. The leopard's gleaming eyes, Max's protective stance, the heart-pounding moments before the big cat retreated. The fear still sat heavy in his chest, making his hands shake slightly as he ran them through his hair. Through the barn door, he could see Max lounging in a patch of sunlight, his fur golden in the morning light. The sight of his dog resting so peacefully helped calm Michael's racing thoughts. He stood up, his boots crunching on the hay-strewn floor, and made his way to the yard. Max's ears perked up as Michael approached, but he didn't move from his sunny spot. Michael lowered himself to the ground beside his companion, reaching out to scratch behind Max's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, completely at ease. "You were something else last night, buddy," Michael said softly, his voice full of pride. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd stand up to that cat like that." Max's tail thumped against the ground as Michael spoke, his eyes half closed in contentment. As Michael continued to stroke Max's fur, he noticed how different his dog seemed from just a few weeks ago. Gone was the fearful, withdrawn animal who had survived the first attack. In his place was a confident, brave companion who hadn't hesitated to protect their home. The transformation brought a lump to Michael's throat. "We've both changed, haven't we?" he murmured, and Max pressed closer to his side in response. Later that afternoon, Michael began working on reinforcing the yard's defenses. He gathered tools and materials, determined to build stronger barriers around their property. Max stayed close, patrolling the perimeter as Michael worked, his watchful eyes scanning the tree line. Together, they moved around the yard, Michael hammering and securing new boards while Max kept guard. Every so often, Michael would look up from his work to find Max alert and attentive, taking his self-appointed security duty seriously. As the sun began to set, Michael stepped back to survey their work. The new barriers stood tall and strong, a testament to their shared determination to protect their home. Max padded over to stand beside him, their shadows stretching long across the yard. "Together, we'll keep this place safe," Michael said softly, looking down at his faithful companion. Max barked once in agreement, his tail wagging as he gazed up at Michael, their bond evident in the quiet moment they shared. Michael stood by the farmhouse window, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands as he watched Max in the yard. The morning sun highlighted his dog's playful movements as he chased after a stick, his tail wagging with unbridled joy. The sight brought a smile to Michael's face, washing away the lingering anxiety from the previous night's encounter with the leopard. "Go get it, boy!" he called through the open window, and Max bounded after the stick with renewed enthusiasm. The transformation in his companion was remarkable. From a frightened, broken spirit to this confident, energetic guardian of their home. Max wasn't just a pet anymore. He had become something more. A partner, a protector, a friend. The sound of tires on gravel drew Michael's attention. Tom's old pickup truck pulled into the driveway, tools rattling in the back. Max trotted over to greet their visitor, his tail wagging in welcome, a far cry from his previously timid behavior around strangers. "Morning, Michael," Tom called out as he climbed down from his truck. "Brought over some tools I thought might come in handy." He paused to pat Max's head before walking toward the house. Michael met him on the porch, offering a grateful smile. "Thanks, Tom. That's real kind of you." Tom's eyes swept over the reinforced fences, nodding appreciatively. "You've done good work here. Those are some solid improvements." He ran his hand along one of the new fence posts. "Heard about what happened last night. Word travels fast around here." Michael leaned against the porch railing. "Yeah, it was quite a night. But Max ... He glanced at his dog with pride. "Max stood his ground, scared that cat right off." "You've both come a long way," Tom observed, his eyes twinkling. "Remember when I first stopped by? You could barely look me in the eye, and Max was hiding in the shadows. Now look at you both." Michael felt warmth spread through his chest at Tom's words. He hadn't really thought about it, but Tom was right. The past few weeks had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't just a better farmer or dog owner. He was a better person. Later that evening, Michael sat in his favorite armchair by the crackling fire. Max lay contentedly at his feet, the firelight dancing across his fur. The house felt different now. Warmer, more like a home. The crushing loneliness that had once filled these rooms had been replaced by a comfortable sense of peace. Max lifted his head, his brown eyes meeting Michael's. There was something in that gaze, trust, loyalty, understanding, that touched Michael deeply. He reached down to pat Max's head gently. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said softly. Max responded by resting his head on Michael's lap, closing his eyes with a contented sigh. The farm settled into a hushed rhythm in the days after the leopard's return. Michael moved through his chores with careful attention, checking fences and tending to the animals, while keeping a watchful eye on the tree line. Max stayed close, his presence both comforting and constant, but Michael couldn't shake the unease that clung to him like morning mist. As he repaired a broken gate hinge, Michael's hands worked steadily while his mind wandered. The land around him felt different now, both familiar and strange. This was his inheritance, passed down through generations of his family, but somehow he'd let it slip away from him, just as he'd let his connection with Max fade over those dark years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields when Michael finally set down his tools. His muscles ached from the day's work, but it was a good kind of tired, honest and earned. He walked to the edge of the eastern field, where the land dropped off into a gentle slope. The horizon stretched out before him, painted in soft oranges and purples. Max padded over quietly and settled beside him in the grass. Michael's throat tightened as memories washed over him. Countless evenings spent in a fog of alcohol instead of out here with Max. Mornings lost to hangovers while his faithful dog waited, chained and alone. The weight of those wasted years pressed down on his shoulders. "I really messed up, didn't I?" he whispered, more to himself than to Max. The dog's ears perked up at his voice, but Michael was lost in thought, seeing himself through time's harsh lens. He'd inherited this land with such promise, such hope. Instead, he'd nearly let it slip through his fingers, along with everything else that mattered. The question nagged at him, could he really make things right? Was he worthy of the second chance he'd been given? The doubt felt heavy in his chest, mixing with the guilt that still lingered despite all their progress. Max shifted beside him, pressing his wet nose against Michael's hand. The touch pulled Michael back to the present moment. He looked down at his companion, seeing the trust in those brown eyes. Max's tail wagged slowly, stirring the grass beneath them. Michael's hand found its way to Max's head, fingers running through the familiar fur. "I can't change what's been done," he murmured, "but I'll make sure we have a future." Max looked up at him, tail still wagging, and something in Michael's chest loosened just a bit. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe that wasn't what mattered most anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmland as Michael threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. Every nail he hammered, every board he replaced, felt like a step toward redemption. The old barn door that had hung crooked for years now swung true on its hinges. The broken fence posts were replaced one by one, standing straight and proud against the sky. Max never strayed far from Michael's side during these repairs. The dog's presence was constant, watching Michael's every move with attentive eyes. Sometimes he'd fetch tools when Michael pointed to them, seeming to understand exactly what was needed. Their synchronized movements spoke of a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. The farm was slowly transforming under Michael's dedicated care. Fresh paint brightened the weathered walls, new gravel crunched underfoot on the previously muddy paths, and the vegetable garden sprouted promising green shoots. Each improvement, no matter how small, filled Michael with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. As the afternoon sun beat down, Michael wiped sweat from his brow and surveyed his work on the chicken coop. The satisfaction of honest labor had replaced his old cravings, and the farm was beginning to feel like home again. Max lay nearby in the shade, alert but relaxed, until something caught his attention. Without warning, Max bolted upright and charged toward the tree line, barking fiercely. Michael's heart leaped into his throat as he dropped his hammer and ran after him. Memories of the leopard attack flashed through his mind, spurring him faster across the field. His boots pounded against the earth as he called out, "Max! Wait!" When he caught up, he found Max standing rigid at the edge of the woods, his attention fixed on something in the undergrowth. Michael's breath came in quick gasps as he searched the shadows between the trees, expecting to see the leopard's deadly form emerging from the darkness. Instead, a small red fox darted out from beneath a bush, its tail streaming behind it as it fled deeper into the woods. Max looked back at Michael, tail wagging proudly, as if to say, "See? I protected us." Michael couldn't help but laugh, the tension draining from his shoulders. He crouched down beside his faithful companion, scratching behind Max's ears. "You had me scared there, buddy," he said softly. Max soaked up the attention for a moment before turning and trotting confidently back toward the farmhouse. Michael watched him go, his heart full of gratitude for the loyal friend who had given him a second chance at life. The old barn creaked softly in the evening breeze as Michael sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes. His fingers traced the edges of a worn photo album he'd discovered buried beneath years of accumulated memories. The leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pictures inside remained vibrant with life. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he turned each page. There he was, 10 years younger, his face unlined by worry and bright with hope. In one photo, he held a squirming Max as a puppy, both of them caught mid-laugh by the camera. Another showed them playing fetch in the summer sun, Max's small body stretched out in full sprint after a tennis ball. "We were happy then," Michael whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the evening crickets. Each photograph felt like a reminder of everything he'd thrown away. The smiling man in these pictures seemed like a stranger now, someone who hadn't yet let alcohol steal his joy, someone who hadn't chained his best friend to a post and forgotten about him. The weight of those years pressed down on Michael's chest as he flipped through more pages. Here was Max on his first birthday, wearing a ridiculous party hat. There they were hiking together in the mountains, back when adventure filled their days. Each image carved deeper into Michael's heart, reminding him of promises broken and trust betrayed. Unable to bear it any longer, Michael slammed the album shut. His hands were shaking harder now, and his throat felt tight. How many years had he wasted? How many moments had he missed? The guilt rose like a tide, threatening to drown him. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over a box in his haste to escape the memories. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, but it did little to calm the storm in his mind. He paced the yard, his thoughts spinning with regret. Could anyone really come back from such betrayal? Did he deserve forgiveness after everything he'd done? The sound of padding feet made him turn. Max approached, his tail wagging in greeting. The dog's eyes held no judgment, no hint of the pain Michael had caused him. He simply came forward, happy to see his human as he always was these days. Michael crouched down, meeting Max's gentle gaze. "I've hurt you, haven't I?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Max stepped closer, pressing his nose against Michael's cheek in a gesture of pure affection. The simple act of forgiveness brought tears to Michael's eyes. As he rubbed Max's head, a small smile found its way to his face. "I'll make it right, I promise," he said softly. Max's tail wagged harder, as if understanding the weight of the moment. The farm hummed with renewed life as Michael worked under the warm morning sun. The once neglected property had transformed over the past few months. Fresh paint brightened the barn's weathered walls, new fencing stretched across green pastures, and rows of sprouting crops dotted the fields. The air carried the sweet scent of fresh hay and blooming wildflowers. Max trotted alongside Michael as he carried tools from the shed, his tail wagging with enthusiasm. The dog's presence had become a constant comfort, matching Michael's steps as they moved from task to task. Together, they'd created a rhythm that made the work feel less like labor and more like purpose. As Michael approached the livestock pens for his morning check, he noticed something odd about the fence. Several posts looked askew, and there were marks along the lower section. His stomach tightened as he moved closer to inspect the damage. Max's ears perked up suddenly. He let out a sharp bark and darted toward the compromised section of fence. Michael's heart jumped into his throat as he hurried after his dog, memories of the leopard attack flashing through his mind. When they reached the damaged area, Michael let out a relieved breath. The fence was scratched and slightly bent, but nothing serious had breached their defenses. Max sniffed around the area, his tail held high and alert. As Michael examined the marks more closely, an idea began to form in his mind. He'd been meaning to upgrade their security system, and this minor scare provided the perfect motivation. He patted Max's head and headed to his truck, returning with supplies he'd purchased for just such a purpose. Throughout the afternoon, Michael installed motion sensors and connected them to an alarm system. Max kept vigilant watch, patrolling the perimeter as Michael worked. The sun painted long shadows across the grass as they finished the final connections. Michael stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead as he surveyed their work. The new system would alert them to any approaching threats, giving them the peace of mind they both needed. "We did it, Max," Michael said, pride evident in his voice. Max barked cheerfully in response, making Michael laugh. Together, they walked back to the farmhouse, their footsteps in sync, both feeling the satisfaction of another job well done. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Michael worked near the barn, his muscles aching from the day's labor. Max lounged nearby in a patch of grass, his watchful eyes never straying far from his owner. The peaceful rhythm of their morning was broken by the familiar rumble of an approaching truck. Tom's old pickup rolled down the dirt road, kicking up dust as it made its way toward the barn. Michael straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve as he watched his neighbor park. The sight of a friendly face brought a genuine smile to his lips. "Morning, Michael," Tom called out, waving as he stepped down from his truck. Max's tail wagged in recognition of their frequent visitor. As Tom walked around the property, his eyes widened at the visible improvements. The once neglected farm had transformed. Fresh paint gleamed on the barn walls, new fencing stretched across the fields, and healthy crops sprouted in neat rows. "Can hardly believe this is the same place," Tom remarked, shaking his head in admiration. "You've really turned things around here." They settled onto the porch steps, the wooden boards creaking beneath them. The conversation drifted to earlier days when Michael had kept to himself, barely speaking to anyone. Tom's voice grew serious as he brought up recent developments in the area. "Been seeing more tracks lately," Tom said, his expression concerned. "Wildlife's getting bolder. Some folks think the leopard might still be lurking around these parts." Michael's chest tightened at the news. That night, as he prepared for bed, the weight of Tom's words pressed heavily on his mind. The darkness beyond his window seemed to hold new threats, and every rustle of leaves made him tense. Max padded over to where Michael sat on the edge of his bed, sensing his distress. The dog rested his head on Michael's lap, offering silent comfort. Michael's fingers found their way to Max's fur, drawing strength from the warm presence of his faithful companion. "We've come so far, buddy," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "We won't go back." Max's steady breathing and unwavering presence helped calm his racing thoughts, reminding him that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A few days after Tom's warning, Michael's heart nearly stopped when he discovered fresh paw prints in the soft earth near the livestock pens. Large, distinctive marks that could only belong to one creature. The leopard had returned. His hands trembled as he counted his animals, finding 2 sheep missing from the flock. "Max, come here, boy," Michael called, his voice tight with worry. Max trotted over, his ears perked and alert. The dog's demeanor changed instantly upon catching the scent near the prints, his body becoming tense and watchful. Michael immediately began working, his movements quick and purposeful as he reinforced the weak spots in the fencing. He added extra boards, checked all the locks, and installed more lights around the perimeter. As night fell, Michael and Max took up their position in the barn. The structure creaked and groaned in the darkness, each sound making Michael's muscles tense. He sat on an old wooden crate, his flashlight ready, while Max lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. Hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made Michael flinch. Max would sometimes growl softly, his eyes fixed on the barn door, causing Michael's heart to race. But each time, the night would return to its heavy silence. The first hints of dawn were just beginning to lighten the sky when they saw it, a dark shape moving with fluid grace toward the livestock pens. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the leopard's distinctive silhouette. Before Michael could move, Max sprang into action. The dog charged forward, his bark fierce and commanding, showing none of the fear from his previous encounter. The leopard hesitated, then turned to face the oncoming dog. But Max didn't back down. He continued his assault, driving the predator back step by step until the leopard finally turned and disappeared into the tree line. Michael watched in amazement as Max stood his ground, making sure the threat was truly gone before returning to his side. Pride swelled in Michael's chest as he knelt beside his brave companion. "You did it, Max. You really did it," Michael said softly, running his hands through Max's fur. The dog pressed against him, tail wagging, both of them knowing they had faced their fears together and won. The morning after the leopard's attack, Michael and Max surveyed the damage around the farm. Broken boards lay scattered near the livestock pen, and deep claw marks scarred the wooden posts. Michael's shoulders felt heavy with exhaustion, but he knew the work couldn't wait. As he gathered his tools, the familiar sound of Tom's truck rumbling down the dirt road caught his attention. Tom's dog bounded out first, greeting Max with a friendly bark. Tom stepped out, carrying his own toolbox. "Heard the commotion last night," Tom said, walking over. "Thought you might need an extra pair of hands." Michael nodded gratefully, his throat tight with emotion. Together, they set to work, replacing the damaged boards and reinforcing weak spots. The rhythmic sound of hammering filled the air as they worked side by side, their dogs keeping watch nearby. As the afternoon wore on, Michael found himself opening up to Tom. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. "I wasted so many years," Michael said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Drinking, pushing everyone away. Even Max." He glanced at his dog, who was lounging in the shade nearby. "Sometimes I wonder if I can ever make up for it all." Tom paused his work, looking at Michael thoughtfully. "You know, Michael, the past is just that. The past. What matters is what you're doing now. And from where I'm standing, you're doing pretty well." Michael absorbed these words, feeling their truth settle in his chest. As they continued working, he shared more about his journey, the struggles, the small victories, the daily battle to be better. Tom listened without judgment, occasionally offering gentle advice or sharing his own experiences. By evening, the fence stood stronger than ever. Michael, Tom, and their dogs sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The peaceful moment felt like a reward after the long day's work. Looking at Max resting contentedly beside him, Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude. The farm no longer felt like a place of isolation and regret. Instead, it had become somewhere he could heal, grow, and connect with others. "We're stronger now, Max," Michael said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his dog's ears. Max pressed against his leg, and together they watched the sky transform, surrounded by the quiet comfort of friendship and community. Several months had passed since the leopard's last appearance, and the transformation of the farm was remarkable. The once neglected property now buzzed with life and purpose. Michael stood at the edge of his wheat field, watching Max chase butterflies through the tall grass. The dog's coat gleamed in the sunlight, a far cry from the matted, dull fur he'd had during those dark days of neglect. Every morning, they fell into their comfortable routine. Michael would wake early, Max's tail already thumping against the wooden floor in anticipation. They'd share breakfast on the porch, Michael with his coffee and toast, Max with his bowl of food nearby. The simple pleasure of these quiet moments never failed to fill Michael's heart with gratitude. As they walked through the fields together, Michael marveled at how different everything looked. The fences stood strong and tall, a testament to the community's support. The livestock grazed peacefully in their enclosures, and the crops stretched toward the sky in neat, healthy rows. But more than the physical changes, Michael felt the shift within himself. The guilt that had once weighed him down like a heavy stone had gradually lifted. In its place grew something new, a sense of purpose that brightened each day. He watched Max trot confidently ahead of him, stopping occasionally to look back as if checking on his human companion. The dog's transformation mirrored his own journey from broken to whole. Michael's thoughts no longer tangled themselves in regret. Instead, he found himself focusing on the present, the warmth of the sun, the fresh air, the solid ground beneath his feet. Each step forward with Max taught him something valuable about patience, loyalty, and the power of second chances. As evening approached, Michael settled onto the porch steps, his favorite spot to watch the sunset. Max flopped down at his feet with a contented sigh. The farm stretched out before them, peaceful and serene in the golden light. This place that had once felt like a prison of isolation now represented something entirely different: hope, healing, and new beginnings. Michael looked down at Max, who gazed back at him with eyes full of trust and affection. "We made it, Max, we really did," he whispered. Max's tail thumped gently against the wooden boards in response, and together they watched as the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, their farm basking in the warm glow of evening light. If you enjoyed the story of Michael and Max, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it.